The sun hung low over the Texas plains, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson as dust devils danced across the parched earth. Jacob Thornton rode his mare through the mesquite and sagebrush, his weathered face set in the stoic expression that had become his permanent mask over the past 15 years. Behind him, the small ranch he'd built with his own hands sat nestled in a valley between two ridges, a modest testament to survival in unforgiving country. He'd come west after the war, like so many others, seeking to outrun the ghosts of Shiloh and Gettysburg. The land had been cheap then, almost worthless to those who didn't understand its potential. But Jacob had understood. He'd spent every coin he had on 300 acres of scrubland and a creek that ran year-round, then set about building something that would last. Something to pass down. The thought of legacy brought his son to mind. Samuel was 17 now, lean and tall, with his mother's dark eyes and Jacob's stubborn jaw. The boy had been born to this land, knew nothing of the civilized East or the horrors of battlefield carnage. He'd grown up riding the range, mending fences, and learning to read the weather in the color of the evening sky. As Jacob crested the ridge overlooking his property, he spotted movement near the main house. 3 horses stood tied to the porch rail, none of them familiar. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip, fingers brushing the worn grip as years of instinct sharpened his senses. Strangers didn't just happen by this far from any established trail. He urged his mare forward at a measured pace, neither hurrying nor showing hesitation. As he drew closer, he could make out 3 men on his porch. 2 stood flanking the door, while the third, a broad-shouldered figure in a black duster, sat in Jacob's own rocking chair as if he owned the place. Samuel emerged from the house carrying a tray with a pitcher and glasses. The sight of his son serving these uninvited guests sent a spike of cold anger through Jacob's chest, but he kept his expression neutral as he dismounted. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Jacob said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who'd learned not to show his cards. "Something I can help you with." The man in the rocking chair stood, revealing himself to be nearly 6.5 feet tall. His face was angular and cruel, marked by a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. Jacob recognized the look in those pale eyes. He'd seen it in the faces of men during the war, the ones who'd discovered they enjoyed killing. "Name's Dalton Vickers," the man said, his voice smooth despite the menace behind it. "I represent the Western Land and Cattle Company. We've been buying up properties in this territory, consolidating holdings. I'm here to make you an offer on your spread." Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd heard of the Western Land and Cattle Company. They'd been pushing into the territory over the past year, buying up smaller ranches and homesteads, sometimes through fair dealing, but more often through intimidation and worse. 3 ranchers who'd refused to sell had lost their homes to mysterious fires. Another had simply disappeared, leaving his widow no choice but to accept whatever price they offered. Not interested in selling, Jacob said simply. Vickers smiled, and the expression held no warmth. "I haven't even told you the price yet, Mr. Thornton. Wouldn't matter if you offered me a mountain of gold. This land is my son's inheritance. It's not for sale at any price." The 2 men flanking Vickers shifted slightly, hands hovering near their sidearms. They were hired guns, Jacob realized, not ordinary ranch hands. This was a show of force meant to intimidate. "Mr. Thornton, I don't think you understand how business works out here," Vickers continued, his tone becoming harder. "The West is changing. Small operations like yours are becoming obsolete. The Western Land and Cattle Company represents progress, efficiency. We can do with 10,000 acres what you struggle to do with 300. Then I suggest you go find some other 10,000 acres to purchase." Jacob replied. "Samuel, get in the house." His son hesitated, young pride warring with trained obedience. Finally, Samuel set down the tray and moved toward the door, but not before shooting Vickers a look of pure defiance that made Jacob's heart swell with both pride and fear. Vickers watched the boy go, then turned his cold eyes back to Jacob. "You have a fine son there. Be a shame if something were to happen to him. Accidents are common in cattle country. A boy could get trampled, caught in a stampede, bit while riding the far pastures." The threat was barely veiled, and Jacob felt the old battlefield rage beginning to simmer in his blood. His hand had moved to rest on his revolver before he even realized it. "I think it's time you gentlemen got off my property," Jacob said, each word carefully measured. Vickers studied him for a long moment, then smiled again. "We'll be in town for the next few days, staying at the hotel. You think on my offer, Mr. Thornton. A man can think more clearly when he considers what he stands to lose." The three men moved to their horses with deliberate slowness, a final show of disrespect. As they rode away, Jacob remained motionless on his porch, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, his hand trembling slightly as he removed it from his gun. Samuel emerged from the house. "Pa, what are we going to do?" Jacob looked at his son, seeing both the boy he'd raised and the man he was becoming. "We're going to do what Thorntons have always done. We're going to stand our ground." That night, after supper, Jacob sat at the rough, hewn table he'd built during his first winter on the land and cleaned his weapons. The Colt revolver, the Winchester rifle he kept above the door, and the old cavalry saber he'd carried through the war. Samuel watched in silence, understanding without being told that preparations were being made. "Your mother and I came west to build something lasting," Jacob said as he worked oil into the rifle's action. "She died bringing you into this world, but before she passed, she made me promise that you'd grow up free, on land that belonged to you and nobody else. I aim to keep that promise." "They're going to come back, aren't they?" Samuel asked. "Most likely. How many do you think Vickers has working for him?" Jacob paused in his work, meeting his son's eyes. "Enough that we'll need to be smart about this. In the morning, I want you to ride to the Taylor place. Jim Taylor and I served together during the war. If there's trouble coming, he'll stand with us. The Hendersons might help too, and old Bill Crane has no love for the cattle company." Over the next 3 days, Jacob and Samuel worked to prepare the ranch for what might come. They reinforced the barn doors, moved their best horses to a hidden canyon Samuel had discovered while exploring the far reaches of their property, and stocked the root cellar with supplies. Jim Taylor arrived on the 4th day with his 2 grown sons, both steady men who knew how to handle themselves. The Hendersons sent word they'd come if needed, and Bill Crane rode over himself, ancient but still pied and deadly with the Sharp's rifle he'd carried since before the war. On the 5th evening, as the sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the lookout Samuel had posted at the ridge came galloping in with news. Riders approaching from the east, at least a dozen of them. Jacob gathered his small band on the porch, 5 men against 12, and one of those 5 was a 68-year-old rancher whose best days were behind him. The odds weren't favorable, but Jacob had faced worse at Cold Harbor. "Every man here can leave if he wants," Jacob said. "This is my fight, not yours." Jim Taylor spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Hell with that, Jacob. We all got stakes in this. If Vickers can run you off, he'll come for the rest of us soon enough. Besides, I owe you for pulling me out of that river at Antietam. Figure this squares us." Bill Crane checked the loads in his sharps. "I'm too old to run and too ornery to hide. Let's see if these hired guns have the stomach for a real fight." The riders came at dusk, dark shapes against the dying light. They stopped 50 yards from the house, just out of easy pistol range. Dalton Vickers rode forward alone, his black duster making him look like death incarnate. "Mr. Thornton," he called out. "I'm disappointed. I hoped you'd see reason. Turn around and ride away, Vickers." Jacob called back. "You're not welcome here." "I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, the Western Land and Cattle Company has already purchased this property from the territory government. They declared your claim invalid due to improper filing of the original deed. We own this land now. You're trespassing." The lie was audacious and completely unprovable either way. Out here, 3 days from the nearest territorial office, paperwork meant little. What mattered was who could hold the ground. "That's a lie, and you know it," Jacob said. Vickers shrugged. "Truth is what we make it out here. Now you have 2 choices. You can leave peacefully with your lives and whatever you can carry on your horses, or we can settle this the hard way and you'll leave in a pine box. There's a third choice," Jacob said. "You and your men ride away now, and nobody has to die today." Vickers laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the distance. "You have 5 men, Thornton. I have 12. The arithmetic isn't in your favor." "Maybe not," Bill Crane called out, his gravelly voice strong. "But we'll make sure you're among the first to fall, Vickers. That's a promise." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Vickers sat his horse, calculating, weighing his options. Jacob could see the moment when he made his decision. "Boys," Vickers called to his men, "clear them out." The hired guns began to fan out, looking to surround the house. But Jacob had fought enough battles to know that the defensive position, while limiting your mobility, could be a powerful advantage if used correctly. "Now," he said quietly, Samuel, positioned in the hayloft of the barn, fired first. His shot took one of the gunmen clean out of his saddle. An instant later, the Sharps rifle boomed, and another man fell. The Winchester rifles opened up from the house, and suddenly the approaching riders found themselves caught in a crossfire. The gunfight that followed was brief but brutal. The hired guns, expecting easy pickings, instead found themselves facing men who knew how to shoot and had chosen their ground well. Bill Crane's Sharps spoke twice more, each boom followed by a riderless horse galloping away. The Taylor boys fired with mechanical precision, their shots coordinated and devastating. But the hired guns fought back with the desperation of men who knew they were trapped. Bullets thudded into the wood of the house and barn. One of the Taylor boys went down with a shoulder wound, and Bill Crane took a grazing shot across his ribs that stained his shirt red. Jacob focused on Vickers, who had pulled back from the initial charge and was directing his men from cover behind a small rise. The cattle company man was no coward, but he was calculating, using his men as tools to wear down the defenders. As the fight wore on, the superior position and determination of Jacob's group began to tell. The hired guns, finding no easy victory, began to lose their nerve. When another of their number fell to Samuel's accurate fire from the barn, they broke. It happened suddenly. One man wheeled his horse and spurred away into the gathering darkness. Then another. Within moments, the remaining gunmen were retreating, leaving 4 of their number dead or dying in the dust. Vickers held his ground a moment longer, his face twisted with rage. He locked eyes with Jacob across the distance, and in that moment, both men knew this wasn't over. Then he too turned his horse and rode away, disappearing into the night. The silence that followed the gunfire was almost deafening. Jacob's ears rang from the shots, and smoke hung in the still evening air. Samuel emerged from the barn, his face pale but his eyes blazing with the adrenaline of his first real fight. "Is everyone all right?" Jacob called out. The tailor boy with the shoulder wound was in pain but would live. Bill Crane's wound was superficial despite the blood. Miraculously, no one on their side had been killed, though several bullets had come close enough to leave their mark on flesh or clothing. They spent the next hours tending wounds and burying the dead gunmen in unmarked graves at the edge of the property. It was grim work, but necessary. In the morning, Jacob would ride to town and report the attack to the sheriff, though he held little hope that any real justice would come of it. The Western Land and Cattle Company had deep pockets and likely had the sheriff in those pockets. 3 weeks passed. Jacob kept constant vigilance, expecting Vickers to return with more men and heavier guns. But the expected attack never came. Instead, something else happened. A federal marshal arrived in town, a died man named Coleman, who'd been investigating the Western Land and Cattle Company's activities across multiple territories. The attack on Jacob's ranch, and the bodies that had been reported, gave Coleman the evidence he needed to move against the company's leadership. Dalton Vickers was arrested in Fort Worth on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and intimidation. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of criminal activity stretching across 3 territories. The Western Land and Cattle Company was dissolved, its assets seized, and its leadership prosecuted. Jacob learned all this from a letter delivered by Coleman himself, who rode out to the ranch to thank him personally. The marshal explained that several other ranchers had come forward after hearing about the gunfight, willing to testify now that someone had finally stood up to Vickers. "You did a brave thing," Coleman said as he prepared to ride back to town. "A lot of men wouldn't have had the backbone to face those odds." Jacob shook his head. "Wasn't about bravery, Marshal. It was about protecting what's mine, what's my son's. A man doesn't run when it comes to that." After Coleman left, Jacob stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky. Samuel came to stand beside him, and Jacob put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Is it really over?" Samuel asked. "This part is," Jacob said. "But there'll always be something trying to take what we've built. That's the nature of things. The important lesson is that we stand our ground, we fight for what's ours, and we don't let fear make our decisions for us." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding settling over him like a mantle. "And we don't stand alone. Mr. Taylor, the Hendersons, Bill Crane. They all came when we needed them." "That's right. Community matters out here. We take care of our own, and our own take care of us. That's a bloodline forged not just in family, but in shared struggle and shared values. Remember that." As the years passed, the story of the stand at the Thornton Ranch became part of local legend. Samuel grew into a man who ran the ranch with the same quiet determination his father had shown. He married a schoolteacher from town and brought her to the ranch, and in time they had 3 children of their own. Jacob lived to see his grandchildren playing in the same yard where he'd once faced down Dalton Vickers and his hired guns. He taught them to ride, to shoot, and most importantly, to stand for what they believed in. The ranch prospered under Samuel's management, expanding carefully and sustainably, becoming a cornerstone of the community. On warm evenings, Jacob would sit on that same porch in his rocking chair, the chair where Vickers had once sat so arrogantly, and watch his legacy running through the sagebrush. The land had tested him, tried to break him, but he'd held firm. He'd built something lasting, something worth fighting for. When Jacob Thornton finally passed at the age of 73, the funeral drew people from 3 counties. Jim Taylor spoke at the service, his voice cracking with emotion as he talked about his friend's courage and character. Samuel stood with his own children, holding them close, and understood fully what his father had fought to preserve. The ranch continued to thrive through the generations that followed. Samuel's children grew and stayed on the land, building their own homes on different sections of the expanding property. The Thornton name became synonymous with integrity and resilience in that part of Texas. The old house stood for over 100 years, weathered and worn but solid, a testament to the man who'd built it with his own hands. Eventually, it was carefully preserved as a historical landmark, with a plaque that told the story of the stand against the Western Land and Cattle Company. But the real legacy wasn't in wood and stone. It was in the bloodline itself, in the lessons passed down from Jacob to Samuel, and from Samuel to his children and their children after them. It was in the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm despite it, and that a man's true wealth wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in the values he instilled in those who came after. The Wild West eventually tamed itself, became civilized, grew into cities and highways and modern conveniences. But in quiet corners where old ranches still operated under the same family names, where traditions were maintained and stories were told around dinner tables, the spirit of that earlier time lived on. And on certain evenings, when the sunset painted the Texas sky in those same shades of amber and crimson, if you stood in just the right spot on what was still called the Thornton Ranch, you could almost see a weathered man in dusty clothes standing on his porch, hand resting on a Colt revolver, eyes scanning the horizon with eternal vigilance, forever protecting the legacy he'd forged in determination and blood and unwavering will. That was the bloodline forged in the Wild West, not just of blood and DNA, but of character and conviction, of standing firm when retreat seemed wiser, of building something meant to last beyond one lifetime. It was a legacy that would endure as long as there were Thorntons who understood that some things, once claimed and fought for and held with honor, became more than property. They became sacred trust, passed down through generations, each custodian merely the temporary guardian of something eternal. The West had indeed been wild, but men like Jacob Thornton had tamed it not through domination but through determination, not through brutality but through the willingness to defend what mattered most. And in doing so, they'd created something that would outlast them all, a bloodline forged in the crucible of the frontier, tempered by adversity, and strengthened by the unbreakable bonds of family, land, and honor.